I don't know what they did to that yard, but it looks like something out of a junkyard. Someone needs to report it before the whole neighborhood goes downhill." She said it loud enough for the cluster of neighbors on the sidewalk to hear. Diane Portsmouth stood with her arms folded across her cream linen blazer, her voice carrying the particular confidence of a woman who had never once questioned whether she belonged. She was looking at the house across the street, a craftsman bungalow with a freshly painted sage green door, window boxes overflowing with white impatiens, a front lawn so precisely edged it looked as though someone had used a ruler. She was looking at it and finding it wrong, finding it offensive in a way she could not have articulated if pressed. The neighbors said nothing. Two of them looked at the ground. One woman in a yellow cardigan turned her face slightly away, as though distance were the same as innocence. Diane pulled out her phone and began typing. She had no idea what she had just set in motion. She had no idea who lived in that house, what they had built, what they had sacrificed, or what would happen when the HOA inspector arrived on Crestwood Lane. The report she filed that Tuesday morning would not end the way she imagined. It would end the way it deserved to. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Now, here is what most people on Crestwood Lane did not know about the Coleman family. Marcus Coleman had moved his family into 14 Crestwood Lane on a Thursday in early April, 3 years before Diane Portsmouth ever picked up her phone. He had carried the boxes himself, the heavy ones, the ones that held his wife Renata's grandmother's china and the crate of hardback books he had been collecting since he was 19. He was not a man who made announcements. He was not a man who introduced himself with credentials or accomplishments or the kind of quiet bragging that passes for humility in certain circles. He carried his boxes. He thanked the moving company. He went inside and made coffee in a kitchen that still smelled of fresh paint, and he stood at the window looking out at the front yard with the particular satisfaction of a man who had waited a long time for something and was not about to take it lightly. Marcus was 44 years old. He had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in East Baltimore, the son of a school custodian named Elwood Coleman and a home health aide named Cora. They were not poor in the way that breaks people, but they were careful. Every dollar was accounted for. Cora Coleman had kept a small vegetable garden on the apartment building's shared patio, 6 containers of tomatoes, 2 of collard greens, 1 of herbs she used for everything, and she tended it with the same seriousness she brought to everything else. Marcus had grown up watching his mother kneel beside those containers in the early morning before her shift, her hands moving through the soil with a precision that looked almost surgical. It was Cora who had given him the words he carried into every room he ever entered. She had told him when he was 12 and furious about something at school, when he had come home with his jaw set and his hands clenched, "Marcus, stay low, build high, let your work speak when they won't let you." He had not fully understood it then. He understood it completely now. Marcus was a licensed landscape architect. He had earned his degree from Morgan State, then spent 2 years apprenticing under a firm in Philadelphia before returning to Baltimore to start his own practice, Coleman Green Design, out of a rented desk in a shared office space. He had built it slowly, client by client, yard by yard, park by park. By the time he moved to Crestwood Lane, Coleman Green Design had completed projects in 11 states, won 3 regional design awards, and been contracted by the city of Baltimore to redesign the green spaces in 4 public school courtyards. None of his neighbors, knew any of this. He had not told them. He had simply moved in, carried his boxes, and begun. The yard at 14 Crestwood Lane had been neglected by the previous owners. Patchy lawn, beds overgrown with creeping vinca, and spent hostas. The front walk cracked in 2 places and listed slightly left. Marcus had looked at it the way a surgeon looks at a patient, not with despair, but with a clear assessment of what needed to be done and in what order. He spent the first spring rebuilding the soil. The second spring, he planted. The third spring, everything came in. By April of the year Diane Portsmouth made her call, the yard was something else entirely. The lawn was a dense, even carpet of tall fescue, a variety Marcus had selected specifically for that block's microclimate, its light exposure, its drainage pattern, the way the mature oaks on the western side created a shifting shade canopy each afternoon. The front beds held a layered composition of native plantings, switchgrass, and little bluestem at the back, cone, flower, and black-eyed Susan in the middle, creeping phlox along the border. A climbing hydrangea had been trained along the left side of the porch with a patience that took 2 full years to show. The window boxes were Renata's contribution, white impatiens, replaced every season without fail. Marcus had also repaired the front walk. He had lifted the old concrete, graded the base, and relaid it in a gentle curve of salvaged brick from a demolition site in the neighborhood. The brick was old, its surface worn smooth and warm, and it gave the entrance a permanence the previous concrete had never had. He had done all of this himself, on evenings and weekends, without fanfare. Renata knew what he was building. Their daughter Zora, who was 8 years old and had opinions about everything, had declared the window boxes the best part of the whole street, and she was not wrong, but most neighbors had barely noticed. People on Crestwood Lane were polite in the particular way that keeps distance intact. Diane Portsmouth had lived at 17 Crestwood Lane for 11 years. She knew the HOA bylaws by section number, had served on the Architectural Review Subcommittee for 4 years, and attended every annual meeting with a printed agenda and a highlighted copy of the Community Standards document. She was not a cruel woman in the way that requires intention. She was certain. Certainty was her primary characteristic, the thing that made her capable of standing on a sidewalk and declaring a yard that any trained eye would call beautiful to be something requiring correction. She had noticed the Colemans the week they moved in. She had watched Marcus carry boxes and told herself she was simply being observant. She had noted, without examining the thought, that the house at 14 Crestwood had always been owned by people she recognized, and that this was different. She had told herself it was about property values. She had told herself it was about standards. She had not examined either thought closely enough to see what was underneath. The complaint she filed cited 4 items: overgrown vegetation obscuring the front walk, non-standard plantings inconsistent with neighborhood aesthetic guidelines, unauthorized hardscape modification to the front path, and what she described as a general appearance of disorder inconsistent with community standards. She had taken photographs from across the street. In those photographs, the yard looked exactly like what it was, a masterwork of residential landscape design. But Diane Portsmouth was not looking at it as a landscape architect would. She was looking at it as a woman who had decided, before she raised the camera, what she expected to find. The HOA board received the complaint the following morning. The board's president, a retired insurance executive named Gerald Fitch, read it twice. Gerald was a careful man. He had been on the board for 6 years and had seen complaints filed for reasons that had nothing to do with the stated reasons, and he had learned to read the gap between what was written and what was meant. He read Diane Portsmouth's complaint and felt something settle uneasily in his chest. He approved the inspection because the bylaws required him to. He chose the inspector himself. The inspector Gerald Fitch requested was a woman named Patricia Okafor. Patricia was the HOA's lead compliance officer for the district, a position she had held for 9 years. She carried a standardized evaluation rubric covering 43 distinct criteria across 6 categories: structural maintenance, lawn and turf condition, planting bed composition, hardscape integrity, drainage and grading, and overall aesthetic coherence. She had never, in 9 years, adjusted a score to match an expectation. Gerald knew this. It was precisely why he had called her. Diane Portsmouth did not know Patricia Okafor's name. She did not know that Gerald had chosen the inspector with deliberate care. She did not know, as she refreshed her email waiting for confirmation, that the process she had set in motion was already moving in a direction she had not anticipated. She was certain she had done the right thing. She was certain the inspection would confirm what she already knew. Certainty was her armor, and she had never once found it insufficient. It was about to cost her everything she had assumed about Crestwood Lane. Now, here is what happened when Patricia Okafor arrived. She came on a Friday morning, early, before the heat of the day had settled into the pavement. She parked her gray compact sedan at the curb and sat for a moment before getting out, looking at the property through the windshield with the practiced stillness of someone who had learned to see before she moved. What she saw stopped her, not in the way that problems stop you, in the way that something genuinely extraordinary stops you, the way you pause before a painting that is better than you expected, the way your breath adjusts before you can name why. The front yard of 14 Crestwood Lane was, by any professional measure, exceptional. The lawn was dense and deeply green in a way that spoke of soil health rather than chemical treatment. The planting beds were layered with a sophistication Patricia recognized immediately as the work of someone who understood not just aesthetics, but ecology. The way the native grasses moved in the light morning breeze, the way the cone flowers were positioned to catch the eastern sun, the way the whole composition held together as a system rather than a collection of plants placed for appearance alone. She got out and stood on the sidewalk before opening her clipboard. The brick walk drew her eye. She stepped onto it and crouched, examining the joints, the grade, the way the surface drained away from the foundation in a barely perceptible slope that was, she knew, not accidental. She walked the perimeter slowly, her pen moving across the rubric with the efficiency of long practice. She noted the climbing hydrangea on the porch column. She noted the window boxes. She noted the precise edge between lawn and beds, a line so clean it suggested either a professional crew or a person who found deep satisfaction in the work itself. Patricia Okafor was not easily moved by residential landscaping, but she had also learned over 9 years to notice the gap between what a complaint described and what a property actually was. She had read Diane Portsmouth's complaint that morning before driving over. She had read the phrase "general appearance of disorder" and looked up at the yard and felt something she recognized as professional indignation. Not hot, not loud, but present and precise. She worked through all 43 criteria. She took her time. She photographed each category with the methodical patience of someone who understood that documentation was not bureaucracy. It was protection, for the property owner, for the record, for the truth. Marcus Coleman had come outside midway through the inspection. He had not hovered. He had not explained anything or positioned himself to make the yard look better than it was. He had simply come to the porch, nodded at Patricia, and asked if she needed access to the side yard. She said she did. He unlatched the gate and went back inside. 5 words total. Renata had watched from the front window, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, her jaw set in the particular way that meant she was holding something steady inside herself. Zora had pressed her face against the glass for a moment before Renata gently pulled her back. Patricia sat in her car with the rubric in her lap and looked at the numbers. Then she looked at them again. In 9 years of evaluating properties across the district, she had never given a perfect score across all 6 categories. She looked at the numbers on the page, and she looked at the yard through her windshield, and she understood that the numbers were correct. She picked up her phone and called Gerald Fitch. "Gerald," she said, "I need you to know something before I submit this report." She paused. "This is the highest score in property I have evaluated in 9 years, in the entire district. I want that on the record before it goes anywhere." Gerald said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Submit it exactly as it is." She did. The score was 98.4 out of 100. The 2 categories where she had not given full marks required a minimum of 5 years of established growth, and the hydrangea was only 3 years old. She noted in her written comments that it would almost certainly meet the 5-year standard ahead of schedule. She noted the brick walk as a model of hardscape restoration. She noted the native planting composition as an example of ecological landscape design that the HOA's own guidelines would benefit from studying. She submitted the report at 11:47 on a Friday morning, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon, Gerald had forwarded it to the full board. Diane Portsmouth read the report 3 times. The first time, her eyes moved fast, looking for confirmation of something already decided. The second time, she slowed down. The third time, she sat very still at her kitchen counter with the printed pages in front of her and a cup of tea gone cold at her elbow, and she did not move for a long moment. 98.4. She said the number aloud, once, to the empty kitchen, and the sound of it did not match anything she had prepared herself to hear. She had expected violations. She had expected the inspector to arrive, walk the property, and confirm what she already knew, that something was wrong over there, that something needed correcting. She had filed the complaint with the confidence of a woman who had always been right. She had been the one to successfully petition for the removal of a chain-link fence on the east end of the block. She had been the one to document the cracked gutters at number 9 until they were replaced. She had not considered the possibility that she would not be right now. But 98.4 was not a violation. 98.4 was a verdict. She read Patricia Okafor's written comments again. The part about the native planting composition, the part about the brick walk, the phrase model of hardscape restoration. The sentence recommending the HOA's own guidelines study the property as an example of ecological landscape design. Something moved through her chest that she did not have a name for. Not quite shame. Not yet. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as shame but had not yet found its address. She told herself there had to be an error. She told herself numbers could be wrong. She did not examine those thoughts closely enough to see what was underneath them. What she did not know was that Gerald Fitch had already called a special board session for the following Wednesday. What she did not know was that 3 of the board's 5 members were now asking questions that had nothing to do with the yard at 14 Crestwood Lane and everything to do with the complaint that had triggered the inspection. The board met in the community room of the Crestwood Lane Clubhouse on a Wednesday evening in late April. The room smelled of old carpet and the particular staleness of spaces used only occasionally, and the fluorescent lights gave everyone's face a quality of tired exposure. Gerald Fitch sat at the head of the table. Patricia Okafor sat to his right with her clipboard and a second copy of the report. Diane Portsmouth had not been invited. She would learn about the meeting later, in a way she had not anticipated. Gerald opened the session by reading the complaint aloud, all 4 items. He read them without inflection the way a judge reads a charge, not to persuade, but to establish. When he finished, he set the paper down and looked at the board. "Patricia," he said, "walk us through what you found." Patricia Okafor did not need her notes. She described each of the 6 categories in order: the lawn, the planting beds, the brick walk, the drainage grade, the climbing hydrangea, the window boxes. She described the ecological coherence of the native planting composition in language that was technical but not inaccessible, the kind of language that makes a room lean slightly forward. She described the score. She described the 2 points she had not awarded and the reason for them, and noted again that the hydrangea's training was so precise the 5-year standard would almost certainly be met ahead of schedule. When she finished, the room was quiet. One of the board members, a woman named Sylvia Tran, who had served on the Architectural Review Subcommittee alongside Diane Portsmouth for 2 years, cleared her throat and looked at the table. She had read the report on Saturday. She had driven past 14 Crestwood Lane on Sunday morning and sat in her car looking at the yard, and she had felt something she recognized as discomfort. Not at the yard, but at herself. At the fact that she had seen that yard every week for 3 years and had never once said anything about it. "I want to say something," Sylvia said. She paused. "I've driven past that house for 3 years. I should have said something a long time ago." She looked at Gerald. "I'm saying it now. That yard is exceptional. Whatever prompted this complaint, it was not the yard." Gerald Fitch nodded once. He picked up the complaint and set it down. "The complaint cites 4 items," he said. "Patricia's report finds 0 violations across all 43 criteria and returns the highest score in the district in 9 years. He paused. "That is a significant gap between what was alleged and what exists." He did not say Diane Portsmouth's name. He did not need to. The board voted that evening to formally close the complaint with the finding of no violations. They voted to add a notation to the property file at 14 Crestwood Lane, acknowledging the score and Patricia Okafor's written commendation. They voted on a motion from Sylvia Tran to amend the HOA's Community Standards Guidelines to include native and ecological planting compositions as explicitly compliant with neighborhood aesthetic requirements, a change that had been needed, Sylvia noted quietly, for some time. Gerald Fitch drafted the letter to Diane Portsmouth himself. It was 2 paragraphs. The first informed her that the complaint had been found without merit. The second reminded her, in language that was precise without being cruel, that the HOA's complaint process existed to address genuine violations, and that complaints filed without a reasonable basis in observable fact placed a burden on the community's resources and on the property owners subjected to them. He did not threaten. He did not accuse. He stated what was true. He signed it and sent it. Now, here is what happened when Gerald Fitch called Marcus Coleman. He called on a Thursday morning. Marcus was in his studio, a converted room at the back of the house where he kept his drafting table and his reference library, and the framed photograph of his mother's container garden that had hung above every desk he had ever worked at. The studio smelled of drafting paper and the particular dry warmth of a room where serious work is done. And Marcus had learned to think clearly in that smell the way some people think clearly only in silence. His phone rang. He saw the name Gerald Fitch and felt something settle in his chest. Not relief exactly, but the particular calm of a man who has been patient and is now about to learn whether the patience was justified. He answered. Gerald introduced himself fully and then said, "Mr. Coleman, I want to begin by apologizing on behalf of the board for the fact that this inspection was necessary at all." He paused. "Your property received a score of 98.4 out of 100. It is the highest score in the district in the 9 years our lead compliance officer has been evaluating properties. The complaint has been closed with a finding of no violations." Marcus said nothing for a moment. He was looking at the photograph of his mother's container garden. He was thinking about a 12-year-old boy who had come home furious with his jaw set and his hands clenched, and about the woman who had looked at him and said, "Stay low, build high, let your work speak when they won't let you." "Thank you, Gerald," he said. "I appreciate you calling." 7 words total. Gerald cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. The board is amending the community standards guidelines to explicitly include native and ecological planting compositions as compliant with neighborhood aesthetic requirements. Your yard was the reason for that change." A pause. "I thought you should know." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's good. That's the right thing to do." He said it without satisfaction and without pride. He said it the way a person says something true. When he hung up, he sat for a long moment in the dry, warm quiet of his studio. He did not call anyone. He did not go to the window. He reached across the drafting table, picked up the pencil he had set down when the phone rang, and went back to work. Renata was in the kitchen when he came out an hour later. She looked at his face and read it the way she had learned to read it over 17 years of marriage, not for what it showed, but for what it had stopped holding. "Well," she said. 98.4, he said, "highest in the district." Renata set down the dish she was holding. She crossed the kitchen and put both hands on either side of his face and looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "Your mother knew." He nodded. He did not trust his voice entirely in that moment. Zora came in from the hallway in her socks, carrying a book she had already read twice, and looked at her parents standing in the middle of the kitchen. "What happened?" she said. Marcus looked at his daughter, 8 years old, with opinions about everything, and the window boxes were her favorite part of the whole street. "The inspector came," he said. "She looked at the yard." And she said it was good. Zora considered this with the gravity of a person for whom good was not a sufficient word. "How good?" she said. Marcus looked at Renata. Renata looked at Marcus. "The best in the whole district," he said. Zora nodded once, as though this confirmed something she had already suspected, and went back to her book. That was how it ended in the Coleman house on 14 Crestwood Lane. Quietly, without ceremony, the way things end when they were built right in the first place. But the story did not end there. Because what happened next was not something Marcus Coleman asked for or set in motion. It was something the record set in motion on its own. Patricia Okafor had submitted her report through the standard HOA documentation system, which archived all inspection records in a database accessible to property professionals, real estate agents, and municipal planners operating in the district. The report sat in that database the way all reports sit, filed, time-stamped, waiting for the moment when someone with the right question would find it. That moment came 6 weeks later. It would not stay quiet. It would not stay on Crestwood Lane. It would reach further than Diane Portsmouth had imagined anything connected to that yard ever could, and in a direction she had never considered. She had filed her complaint expecting the weight of the institution to land on the house across the street. She had not considered that institutions, when they work correctly, do not distribute weight according to expectation. They distribute it according to evidence. The evidence was 98.4, and the evidence was about to speak. 6 weeks after Patricia Okafor submitted her report, a city planner named David Reyes was working late in a municipal office that smelled of printer toner and the accumulated weight of too many fluorescent hours. David was 31, a junior planner in Baltimore's Department of Recreation and Parks, tasked with identifying residential landscape designers for a new initiative, a pilot program to bring ecological planting principles to 6 public green spaces across 3 underserved neighborhoods on the city's east side. The budget was modest, the timeline was tight, the need was real. He had been searching the district's property database for professionals whose residential work demonstrated the kind of ecological fluency the program required because he had learned in 3 years of municipal planning that the gap between someone who could describe ecological design and someone who could actually execute it was wide enough to lose a project in. He found the report for 14 Crestwood Lane at 11:14 on a Tuesday night. He read it twice. He read Patricia Okafor's written comments a third time. He looked up the property address, pulled the street view image, and sat back in his chair. Then he searched the name on the property record. Marcus Coleman. Coleman Green Design. He typed the firm name into a separate window and spent the next 20 minutes reading. 11 states, 3 regional design awards, the Baltimore Public School courtyard contracts, a body of work that was exactly what the program needed. He had been looking for weeks. The answer had been sitting in a database, filed under a complaint closed with a finding of no violations and the highest inspection score in the district. David Reyes called Coleman Green Design the following morning. Marcus answered on the second ring. The conversation was professional and direct. David explained the program, the scope, the timeline, the budget. He explained how he had found the firm. He said the words 98.4, and there was a brief silence on the line, and then Marcus said, "I know the property." David said, "I thought you might." They met in person 3 days later at the first of the 6 sites, a cracked and sun-baked plaza behind a middle school in East Baltimore, the kind of space that had been neglected so long it had become invisible to the people who passed it every day. Marcus walked the site with his hands in his pockets and his eyes moving across the ground in the particular way of a person who sees not what is there but what could be. He crouched at the edge of the cracked concrete and pressed 2 fingers into the soil beneath it and looked at what came up. He stood. He looked at the light. He looked at the drainage pattern, the way the low end of the plaza collected water after rain, the way the mature oak at the corner threw shade across the western third of the space from mid-afternoon onward. He said, "I can work with this." 4 words. David Reyes had brought his supervisor to that first site visit. Her name was Constance Whitfield, and she was the kind of woman who had spent 20 years in municipal planning developing a precise and unsentimental eye for people who delivered and people who did not. She watched Marcus Coleman walk that plaza for 40 minutes without saying a word, and when he finally turned and said what he could do with it, she looked at David Reyes and nodded once. The contract was signed 2 weeks later. Now, here's what happened to Diane Portsmith. Gerald Fitch's letter arrived on a Saturday. She read it at the kitchen counter in the same spot where she had sat with the inspection report, and the morning light came through the window at the same angle, and the kitchen was the same kitchen, and everything was exactly as it had been, except that nothing was. The letter was 2 paragraphs. She read the first and set it down. She picked it up and read the second. She read the phrase "complaints filed without a reasonable basis in observable fact," and felt something move through her that was not quite anger and not quite humiliation, but lived in the territory between them, the place where certainty goes when it collapses. She had not expected the letter. She had expected in some part of herself she had not examined that the matter would simply close quietly, that the inspection would find something, or that the whole thing would be forgotten, or that the record would absorb it the way institutions sometimes absorb things that are inconvenient to examine. She had not expected a letter that used the word burden. She had not expected to be the one holding it. She sat with it for a long time. What she did not know, sitting at that kitchen counter, was that Sylvia Tran had told 2 other people on the block about the board meeting, the vote, and the score. What she did not know was that people talk, and that a story about a yard scoring 98.4 in response to a complaint about disorder has a particular quality of irony that makes it travel. It traveled. By the end of the following week, 3 people on Crestwood Lane had stopped Diane Portsmith in ordinary neighborhood encounters, at the mailbox, in the driveway, once at the small grocery 2 streets over, and each encounter had the same quality of careful, deliberate distance that is worse in its way than open confrontation. Nobody accused her. Nobody raised their voice. They simply looked at her with the expression of people who know something and have decided that knowing it is sufficient. Diane Portsmith had lived on Crestwood Lane for 11 years. She had organized herself around this neighborhood, its standards and meetings and complaint processes, the particular authority of a person who knows the bylaws by section number. That authority had not been taken from her by anyone. It had simply become, in the space of a few weeks, a different thing than it had been. Evidence of something she did not want to be evidence of. She resigned from the HOA's Architectural Review Subcommittee in May. She sent a brief email to Gerald Fitch citing scheduling conflicts. Gerald replied with 2 sentences of acknowledgement and no further comment. Sylvia Tran was appointed to fill the vacancy. She accepted. Marcus Coleman did not know about Diane Portsmith's resignation when it happened. He learned of it later, secondhand, from Gerald Fitch in a brief exchange at the end of a phone call about something else entirely. Gerald mentioned it in passing, without emphasis, and Marcus said, "I see." And they moved on. He did not think about it again for a long time. He was busy. The first of the 6 East Baltimore sites was breaking ground in June, and he had drawings to finalize and materials to source and a crew to coordinate, and the work was what it had always been, the thing that required all of him, the thing that had always been the point. Renata planted new window boxes in May. She chose a deep coral impatiens that caught the afternoon light in a way the white ones never had, and she set them out on a Saturday morning with Zora beside her, the 2 of them working in the quiet companionship of people who are doing something they have done before and will do again. Marcus came to the porch and watched them for a moment. The street was quiet. The oak trees on the western side were in full leaf, their canopy shifting in the light wind, and the front yard held its particular deep green with the settled patience of something built to last. He thought about his mother. He thought about 6 containers on an apartment patio in East Baltimore, tomatoes, collard greens, herbs, and about a woman who had knelt in the early morning before her shift and worked the soil with her hands and had never once asked anyone to notice. He thought about what she had told him when he was 12 years old and furious. And he thought about how long it had taken him to understand that the staying low was not submission. It was foundation. It was the part that held everything else up. He went back inside and sat at his drafting table and picked up his pencil. Now, I want to say something directly to you, because this story is not just about one yard on one street in one neighborhood. This happens every day, not always with a clipboard and a rubric and a score. Sometimes it is a resume that goes unread. Sometimes it is a room that does not make space. Sometimes it is a complaint filed in the language of standards by someone who decided, before they raised the camera, what they expected to find. The people on the receiving end of those complaints are not always landscape architects with 3 regional awards and contracts in 11 states. Sometimes they are simply people who built something beautiful and were told it was wrong before anyone looked at it closely. What Marcus Coleman did was not extraordinary in the way that requires exceptional circumstances. It was extraordinary in the way that requires exceptional patience. He stayed low. He built high. He let the work speak. And when the institution was asked to look at what he had built, it looked honestly, and it said what was true, and the truth was 98.4. The yard at 14 Crestwood Lane is still there. The climbing hydrangea on the porch column is in its 4th year now, and by any professional measure it will meet the 5-year standard ahead of schedule. The brick walk catches the morning light the way old brick does. Warm, worn, permanent. The native grasses move in the wind. The window boxes are coral this season. And somewhere in East Baltimore, on a plaza behind a middle school that used to be cracked concrete and forgotten ground, something is growing. Dignity does not announce itself. It builds. And when the record is finally asked to speak, it speaks in the only language that has ever mattered. Evidence. If you have ever carried something the world refused to see, a skill, a body of work, a quiet excellence that never got the room it deserved, drop a comment below. Tell me what it was. I want to hear it. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that restraint is not weakness, and that the work always speaks eventually. We find the people the world overlooked and tell their stories every single week. If that matters to you, stay with us.